What if I told you that Jerusalem could have become Christian once again? Not through the wars of Richard the Lionheart, nor through the holy madness of Louis IX, but through a peace treaty. If the Sultan of Egypt in the year 1219 personally offered to hand over the holy city in exchange for peace, this deal could have been the greatest bargain in the history of the Crusades, and it was right there, lying on the table. At the head of the Crusader host stood a man who desperately begged for it to be accepted. His name was Jean de Brienne, but he was not born a king. He appeared as a 40-year-old knight without a penny to his name, who received the throne of Jerusalem essentially by winning it in a lottery. This is something they won't show you in history class. Today you will learn how a poor French knight, considered old and not wealthy, gained the crown of Jerusalem simply because he had no enemies. His greatest triumph, how against all odds he led the Fifth Crusade and captured the key to Egypt, Damietta. The fatal mistake, how the papal legate Pelagius, blinded by pride, rejected the Sultan's offer to return Jerusalem, dooming the crusade to destruction. And the humiliation, how Jean de Brienne, king of Jerusalem, was stripped of his crown on the very day of his own daughter's wedding. This is the story of a man who was the perfect king, yet never truly had a kingdom. He turned out to be a diplomat in a world of fanatics and a realist among madmen. We have seen how Louis IX desperately tried to save a cause that was already dead. We have seen how Baybars finished off the remnants of the kingdom. Today, we go back to see that specific moment, that fork in the road, when everything could still have been saved. This is the story of Jean de Brienne, the tragedy of a missed chance. The year is 1210. Acre. This is what remains of the kingdom of Jerusalem. The throne is empty. Or rather, sitting upon it is an 18-year-old girl, Maria of Montferrat, who inherited the crown, but not the power. The barons are in a panic. They don't just need a king, they are looking for a husband for Maria. They require a leader, a military commander who can lead them against the descendants of Saladin. They send ambassadors to the most powerful monarch in Europe, King Philip II of France, with one request: find us a king. And Philip begins to sort through the candidates. He offers this throne, the throne of Jerusalem, to the most noble counts. And they refuse. No one wants this destiny. This inheritance is a one-way ticket. A phantom kingdom, surrounded by enemies, promised certain death, or at best, bankruptcy. And that is when Philip proposes a man whom no one expected, Jean de Brienne. He is 40 years old. By the standards of the era, he is already considered old. He is a younger son from Champagne, resigned to the fact that he has neither a penny nor lands. He has only a reputation as a tough, loyal, but completely unremarkable knight. To Philip, he seemed the perfect choice, representing a safe option. Not too ambitious, not too powerful. Good enough to die in the East without causing problems back home. In 1210, Jean de Brienne, a 40-year-old pauper, arrives in Acre. He is met not as a savior, but as a compromise. The barons look at him with skepticism. This is our king? He immediately marries the 18-year-old queen, Maria. In a single night, a knight who had nothing becomes the king of Jerusalem. He has won the golden ticket. So, Jean de Brienne is king, but his joy proved fleeting. Just 2 years later, in 1212, his young wife, Queen Maria, dies. She dies in childbirth, leaving him a daughter. an infant named Isabella II. And in that very second, Jean de Brienne ceases to be king. By law, the crown immediately passes to his newborn daughter, and he is now nothing more than a regent, a temporary manager at the throne of his daughter. Having received the golden ticket, he lost it in an instant. He is trapped in Acre. He has no money, no power, no army. The barons, who didn't respect him much to begin with, now see him as a simple guardian, a king consort who has lost his only link to the throne. Jean realizes he has only one way to hold on to this crown, only one way to prove that he is a real king. He must do what Richard the Lionheart could not bring himself to do. He must retake Jerusalem. And in 1217, when the Pope announces the Fifth Crusade, Jean de Brienne, the king without a kingdom, becomes its chief military leader. He will lead the army, and he will not lead it to Jerusalem. He will lead it to Egypt, to Damietta.
The year is 1218. The Fifth Crusade lands in Egypt. Their target is Damietta. This is not just a city. It is the key to Cairo, the most powerful fortress in the Nile Delta, protected by triple walls. But its main defense is a massive chain blocking the river, and the tower of the chain on an island which prevented ships from passing. Jean de Brienne, the king regent, is one of the campaign's primary military leaders. In battle, he proves himself not as a king, but as a man who has no right to make a mistake. The siege turns into a nightmare. They cannot take the Tower of the Chain. They cannot block the Nile. And Jean de Brienne shows that he is not merely a compromise. He is a military engineer. He approves a plan to build a gigantic floating siege tower, a land castle mounted on two lashed-together ships. In August 1218, after several failed assaults, this behemoth sails up to the tower, and the knights take it in a bloody battle. The chain is cut, but the siege continues for another year. Scurvy mows down the army. Sultan al-Kamil desperately tries to break the blockade. Jean de Brienne holds the army together. 18 months of hell. And in November 1219, when the Crusaders finally break into the city, Damietta falls. Upon entering the city, the warriors shuddered. Out of 80,000 inhabitants, only between 3,000 and 10,000 remained alive, according to various estimates. The city was a graveyard, but it was taken. It was the greatest triumph of Christian arms since the First Crusade. Jean de Brienne ascended to the summit, proving that he was a true king. All of Europe celebrated. They were certain that Cairo, and subsequently Jerusalem, were about to fall. Damietta is taken. Panic reigns in Cairo. The Sultan of Egypt, al-Kamil, the nephew of the great Saladin, is in terror. Having lost his main port, he fears he cannot withstand the onslaught of the Franks, and he decides to do something Saladin would never have done. The Sultan enters into bargaining. Al-Kamil sends ambassadors to the Crusaders with an offer that seemed impossible to refuse. The deal was simple. You, he said, you withdraw from Damietta and leave Egypt, and I return Jerusalem to you. Now, let that sink in. He was offering them the holy city, the goal of all crusades, for free, without a single blow of the sword. For Jean de Brienne, the king of Jerusalem, this meant triumph, the work of his entire life. But in the camp, there was a man whose authority was higher than that of the king, the papal legate, Cardinal Pelagius Balvani. And in the negotiation tent, a debate began that would decide the fate of the crusade. Jean de Brienne fought his main battle not with steel, but with words. "The kingdom of Jerusalem must be restored," Jean pleaded. "We have been offered the holy city. Our oath is fulfilled. We must accept." He was a realist. He knew the army was exhausted, and they would not be able to hold Egypt. But Pelagius remained a fanatic. Empowered by the easy success at Damietta, he decided that God was leading them to crush Egypt, not to bargain. "The Holy See," he declared, "forbids any deals with enemies of the faith. Our mission is victory, not trade." But this wasn't just fanaticism. It was politics. Pelagius was waiting for reinforcements. He was waiting for a superstar, Emperor Frederick II, who had sworn to the Pope to lead the Crusade, but had never sailed. Pelagius was betting on the phantom army of the emperor against the real Jerusalem lying on the table. Jean de Brienne was furious, but he proved powerless. Pelagius exercised his veto. The best deal in history was rejected, and the Crusader army remained sitting in Damietta. They waited for Frederick for another 2 years. But Sultan al-Kamil, meanwhile, did not wait. He rebuilt his army, he fortified Cairo, and he knew he had the most reliable and powerful ally, the Nile. In July 1221, Pelagius, tired of waiting for Frederick, announced a march on Cairo. Jean de Brienne was horrified. He knew what Pelagius was doing. He knew that in August, the annual flooding of the Nile would begin. He begged them not to go. He said it was suicide. But Pelagius called him a coward again. He threatened Jean with excommunication from the church. And Jean de Brienne, a king without power, was forced to submit. The Crusader army moved on Cairo, and al-Kamil simply retreated before them, luring them deeper into the country, further away from their ships. And then, at the end of August, it happened. The Nile burst its banks. Sultan al-Kamil ordered the sluice gates opened. Water rushed onto the plain where the Crusader camp stood. In a single night, their camp turned into a filthy swamp. They were trapped, cut off by the flood, surrounded by the Egyptian army. This was not Hattin, but something worse. There, warriors were tormented by thirst. Here, the water was drowning them. The catastrophe was total. Pelagius, the very man who rejected Jerusalem, now was forced to crawl to the Sultan and beg for mercy. Sultan al-Kamil was merciful. He proposed a deal. "You," he said, "give me Damietta and get out of Egypt, and I will grant you your lives." Jean de Brienne, standing nearby, had to watch as the man who rejected Jerusalem now gave away Damietta for free, simply to save his own skin. The Fifth Crusade was dead. A unique chance had been lost.
Jean de Brienne returned to Acre with nothing. He had lost everything. He lost Damietta, he lost the army, and he lost Jerusalem, which he had held in his hands. Considered a failed king, he was in dire need of support from a new ally, someone with an army who could save his sinking reputation. And he turned his gaze toward the most powerful, most terrifying, and most scandalous monarch in Europe, to the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II. Frederick II was the wonder of the world. He was excommunicated from the church, he was at war with the Pope, and he was the very man who promised Pelagius he would come to Egypt, but never arrived. Jean de Brienne hatched what he thought was a brilliant plan. He offered Frederick his daughter. He offered him the young Queen Isabella II in marriage. The deal was simple. Frederick marries, receives the title King of Jerusalem, and brings his gigantic army to reconquer the Holy Land. And Jean would remain the respected regent and the father of the victory. In 1225, the wedding took place. 55-year-old Jean led his 14-year-old daughter to the altar. And that same evening,
Immediately after the ceremony, Frederick II showed his true face. He immediately declared himself King of Jerusalem. He stated that Jean de Brienne was no longer regent. He was nobody. Jean was forcibly removed from power, from the court, and from his own child. The humiliation was absolute. Frederick, according to rumors, immediately after the wedding imprisoned his 14-year-old wife in his harem and treated Jean himself like a servant. A 40-year-old knight who won a crown in a lottery, a 50-year-old hero who took Damietta, a 55-year-old king who had his kingdom stolen on his daughter's wedding day. Jean de Brienne, the king without a kingdom, was forced to flee the east. He became an exile. He was a mercenary who served the Pope and fought against Frederick II, his son-in-law, in Italy. It seemed this was the end. Old, humiliated, stripped of everything. But fate had prepared a final, most insane act for him. In 1228, the barons of the Latin Empire in Constantinople, what remained of the Fourth Crusade, were looking for a leader. Their empire was bankrupt. It was surrounded by enemies. They didn't need an administrator. They needed a symbol, a legendary hero who could save them. Their choice fell on the 60-year-old Jean de Brienne. They offered for him to become emperor. Of course, this was just as much a hollow crown as the one Frederick had taken from him. He was becoming emperor of a ghost city that was up to its ears in debt. But for Jean, this was the last chance to die a king. He accepted. Jean de Brienne, now emperor, arrives in Constantinople and discovers that everything is even worse than he thought. He was met by an empty treasury and ruins instead of palaces. And in 1235, his finest hour arrives. A united army marches on Constantinople. The Bulgarian Tsar Ivan Asen II and the Nicaean Emperor John III Dukas Vatatzes. It was a gigantic army meant to wipe the city off the face of the earth. What did Jean de Brienne have? He was 65 years old. He had, according to chroniclers, 160 knights and a handful of infantry. Before us played out a Montjesard performed by a veteran. Jean de Brienne, the 65-year-old emperor of nothing, donned his armor, mounted his horse, and led his 160 knights in a suicidal charge against an army of thousands. And, just like at Montjesard, a miracle occurred. The army of Bulgarians and Greeks, not expecting such fury from an old man they considered a corpse, wavered. The attack was so ferocious, so insane, that the besiegers retreated in panic. This was his final, purest victory. He saved the city. He died 2 years later, in 1237. He died in his own bed as Emperor of the Latin Empire. The history of Jean de Brienne is a drama of missed opportunity. Being perhaps the most sane and yet unhappy monarch of the era, he was the only one who realized that a crusade is not only fanaticism, but also diplomacy. He was on the threshold of the greatest triumph. He could have returned Jerusalem without a single drop of blood. But his dream was destroyed by the blind pride of the fanatic Pelagius. Unlike the warrior Richard or the saintly Louis, Jean appeared as a calculating administrator, but the era demanded either monsters or martyrs. And when he tried to save his kingdom by giving it to the brilliant but cynical Frederick II, the man simply wiped his feet on him and took the crown. Jean de Brienne was a king who always ended up in the right place, but always surrounded by the wrong people. And while he died in exile in Constantinople, the clock was ticking in the Holy Land.
Baybar's empire was growing, and the remnants of Jean's kingdom were preparing for a final, desperate defense. In the next episode, we will transport ourselves to the very end, to the year 1291. We will tell the story of the man who was the last Grand Master of the Templars in the Holy Land, and who died defending the last scrap of ground. This will be the story of Guillaume de Beaujeu, the last defender. If you enjoyed this story about the biggest mistake of the Crusades, please support us with a like and subscribe to the channel. Write in the comments, what do you think was the greater tragedy, Pelagius's mistake or Frederick's betrayal?